It was a typical Sunday afternoon for Marcus Davis. The sun was low, casting a warm glow on the family's cozy home. Marcus had just finished a late breakfast, feeling content after a peaceful morning. He sat on the couch in the living room, holding his baby son, Elijah, in his arms. The little boy cooed softly, his bright eyes looking up at his father. It was a beautiful moment, a time for Marcus to relax and enjoy his growing family. But even as the warm light filtered through the windows, there was something in the air that didn't feel quite right. Marcus couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an uncomfortable feeling building in his chest, something he couldn't shake. Little Elijah, who usually seemed so happy and calm, was acting strangely. He had been fine for most of the morning, laughing and playing with his toys, but something changed. Whenever Marcus placed him near his grandmother, Mrs. Jenkins, the baby would start to cry. At first, Marcus thought it was just a normal fussiness. After all, babies were unpredictable. But as the crying continued, it started to feel different. The kind of crying that made Marcus's stomach twist. It wasn't just a cry for attention, it was a cry of real fear. Marcus gently scooped Elijah back into his arms, trying to comfort him. "Shh, it's okay, buddy," he whispered softly, rocking the baby in his arms. Elijah's tiny hands gripped onto Marcus's shirt, his little body stiff with distress. It was the same every time his grandmother came near. "Mom, could you just give him a little space?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Mrs. Jenkins, his mother, was sitting in the rocking chair across the room, knitting a scarf. She looked up, her face full of concern. "What's wrong with my baby?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, a frown forming on her face. Marcus looked at his mother and then at his son, still crying in his arms. He didn't know how to explain it. Elijah was normally a happy baby. He loved being held, loved playing with people. But when his grandmother came close, it was like a switch flipped. The crying seemed so extreme, so scared. "I don't know, Mom," Marcus said, shaking his head, his voice filled with confusion. "He's been fine all morning. But every time you get close, he gets upset." Mrs. Jenkins sighed. "Maybe he's just tired. You know how babies are, always changing their moods." She smiled, trying to reassure both Marcus and herself, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. Even she seemed unsure of what was happening. Marcus stared at his son, feeling a growing sense of unease. Elijah had never been like this before. He had spent hours with his grandmother in the past, and never once had he reacted this way. Something was off. But what? As the afternoon wore on, the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. Marcus continued to hold Elijah, trying to keep him calm. But the baby was restless, glancing nervously at his grandmother whenever she moved closer. It was as though he was watching her every step, his wide eyes filled with something Marcus couldn't understand, something almost scared. Marcus looked at his mother, who was still sitting in her chair, watching them closely. She hadn't said anything more about the situation, but her expression had changed. It wasn't just concern anymore, it was something else. Something that felt like guilt. Marcus couldn't place it, but the longer he observed his mother and his son, the more he became convinced that something wasn't right. His mother had always been a loving, doting grandmother. She adored all of her grandchildren, and they loved her back. Elijah had always been happy to spend time with her, so why was he reacting like this now? After a few more minutes of Elijah crying, Marcus gently stood up from the couch and began to pace back and forth, trying to calm his son. "Maybe he's just sensitive today," Marcus said, more to himself than anyone else. But the words didn't feel right. Something deep inside him was telling him there was more to the story. There had to be. Suddenly, it hit him. It was a strange thought, one that he quickly brushed aside at first. But the more he thought about it, the more it began to make sense. Elijah wasn't just afraid of being near his grandmother, he was afraid of her. The realization struck Marcus like a bolt of lightning. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a simple phase. There was something about Mrs. Jenkins that was scaring his son, something Elijah could sense, even though he was so young. "Why would he be afraid of you, Mom?" Marcus muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He couldn't shake the question. What was going on? Why was his baby so terrified? Mrs. Jenkins looked over at Marcus, her face suddenly pale. She must have seen something in his expression, something that made her nervous, too. "Marcus, don't look at me like that," she said softly, the hint of fear now creeping into her voice. "You're overthinking this. Babies are unpredictable. It's probably nothing." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He had been a father long enough to know when something wasn't right. And Elijah was scared. Terrified, in fact. The little boy was so afraid of his grandmother that he couldn't even be in the same room as her without crying. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his heart race even faster. Every time Mrs. Jenkins moved closer to Elijah, he would whimper a small, soft sound, but enough for Marcus to hear. Then, Elijah's tiny hands would reach out, grabbing onto Marcus, almost like he was begging for help. It was as though Elijah was looking for safety, desperately trying to get away from something he couldn't fully understand. Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just a random phase. This was something much deeper. But what was it? What was his mother hiding? And why was his son reacting this way? Marcus had always seen his mother, Mrs. Jenkins, as the heart of the family. She was a woman of grace and strength, the one everyone turned to in times of trouble. Whenever the family faced hardship, Mrs. Jenkins was there, ready to offer comfort, advice, or just a warm hug. She had been a guiding force in Marcus's life, always there with a kind word or a gentle hand. She was more than just his mother, she was the matriarch of the whole family. Everyone looked up to her, and Marcus had never questioned her role in the family. But now, as he sat in the quiet living room, watching his mother with Elijah, something felt different. Something was changing inside him. It wasn't just that his son was crying, it was the way Elijah reacted to her. It was the fear in the baby's eyes. It was the way he trembled every time his grandmother came near. Elijah had always been a happy, curious baby, and he had never shown fear like this before. And now, Marcus was beginning to see his mother in a different light. The air in the room seemed thick with tension. Marcus could feel it building, like a storm on the horizon. Every time Elijah cried, it felt like a new weight was added to the growing pile of unanswered questions. And with each passing moment, Marcus felt his frustration building. Something was wrong. He didn't know what it was yet, but he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut. "Elijah's not usually like this," Marcus said aloud, his voice edged with frustration. "He's never had this reaction with anyone else." He looked down at his son, who was still trembling in his arms, clinging to him like a lifeline. Elijah's tiny hands were gripping Marcus's shirt so tightly, as if he was trying to hold on for dear life. His wife, Rachel, was sitting on the couch nearby, watching the scene unfold. She had been quiet for most of the morning, trying to make sense of the situation, but she was just as confused as Marcus. "Maybe he's just teething," she suggested softly, trying to offer a simple explanation for Elijah's distress. "That could be why he's crying so much." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He knew his son's cries. He knew what they meant. This wasn't the usual fussing of a teething baby. This was something different. Elijah wasn't just upset, he was terrified. His tiny face was scrunched up in fear, and his cries were high-pitched and frantic, unlike anything Marcus had ever heard before. "No," Marcus replied, his voice firm but filled with doubt. "It's not that. I've seen Elijah when he's teething before. He's never reacted like this. Rachel frowned, clearly not sure what to say next. She knew Marcus was worried, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. She didn't want to make things worse by overreacting. But the truth was, she was starting to feel uneasy too. Every time Elijah cried, she felt a chill run down her spine. The tension in the room was growing, and it was starting to feel like something was wrong, something they couldn't quite explain. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of Elijah's sobs. Marcus gently rocked him back and forth, trying to soothe him, but it wasn't working. The baby was still crying, still clutching onto him with all his might, his little body trembling. The tension between Marcus and his mother started to grow. At first, it had been subtle, just a feeling in the back of his mind. But now, as he watched his mother's reaction, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Every time Elijah cried, Mrs. Jenkins looked more and more uncomfortable. She seemed nervous, almost guilty, as if she was hiding something. It was hard to put into words, but Marcus could sense that something wasn't right. It was as if there was something lurking beneath the surface, something his mother wasn't telling him. He tried to brush it off at first, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling. Why was Elijah so afraid of her? Why was his son reacting like this? Marcus looked over at his mother, who was sitting silently in the rocking chair, her knitting abandoned in her lap. She was staring at Elijah, her face unreadable. Her lips were pressed together in a tight line, and her eyes seemed distant, as if she was lost in thought. There was something about her expression that unsettled Marcus. She didn't look like the loving grandmother he knew. She looked troubled. Like she was holding back something. Something important. He couldn't put it into words, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't ignore this any longer. "Mom," Marcus said slowly, his voice tight with frustration, "what's going on? Why is Elijah acting like this around you?" His mother blinked, clearly startled by the question. She opened her mouth to say something but then closed it again. It was as though she was struggling to find the right words, or maybe trying to hide something. Marcus watched her closely, trying to read her expression. But his mother was a master at hiding her emotions. She had always been good at keeping her feelings to herself, at pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. "Marcus," she finally said, her voice soft but steady, "you're overreacting. It's just a phase. Babies go through these things all the time. It's nothing to worry about." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He could hear the hesitation in her voice, the way her words didn't quite match the look in her eyes. Something wasn't right. There was more to this than she was letting on. He glanced at Rachel, who was sitting beside him, her face full of concern. She had been quiet until now, but Marcus could tell she was just as uneasy as he was. She reached over and touched his arm, offering him a small, reassuring smile. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. She, too, felt the growing tension in the room. "Maybe we should just take a step back," Rachel said gently. "Maybe we're just overthinking this. Elijah might just be going through a tough time." Marcus shook his head, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "I don't think so," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't think this is normal. Elijah's not just upset. He's scared. And I don't know why." The tension between Marcus and his mother continued to build, each passing minute making it harder to ignore the questions racing through his mind. Why was Elijah afraid of her? Why was his son, who had always been a happy and calm baby, suddenly reacting with such terror? The more Marcus thought about it, the more the questions piled up. He felt a growing sense of dread, an uncomfortable feeling that something terrible was about to be revealed. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, still holding Elijah in his arms. His son's tiny body was tense, his small hands clutching Marcus's shirt with an almost desperate strength. It was heartbreaking. He had seen Elijah go through small discomforts before teething, gas pains, and even colic, but this was different. This was a fear that Marcus couldn't explain. And the most troubling part was that the fear was directed at his mother. He looked back at Mrs. Jenkins, sitting silently in the rocking chair. Her eyes were lowered now, as though avoiding his gaze. It wasn't like her at all. She had always been so open, so ready to answer any question. But now, she seemed closed off, her shoulders tense in a way that Marcus had never seen before. It was like there was something she didn't want to share, something she wasn't willing to admit. Marcus felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to accuse his mother of anything, not without reason. But how could he ignore what was happening with Elijah? His son's reactions were undeniable. They were real, and they were growing worse by the minute. Every time Mrs. Jenkins made a move toward him, Elijah's crying escalated. His screams were raw and frantic, not the kind of noise that came from a simple discomfort. It was as if he were in pain, as if something was deeply wrong. "Mom," Marcus said again, his voice firmer this time, "what's going on? You need to tell me." Mrs. Jenkins seemed to flinch at the question, her face tightening. She stared at the floor for a long moment before lifting her eyes to meet his. There was something cold in her gaze now. Something that made Marcus feel uneasy, like he was no longer speaking to the same person he had known all his life. "I've already told you, Marcus," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. "It's just a phase. Babies cry. It's nothing to worry about." But Marcus wasn't convinced. His instincts were screaming at him to dig deeper. The fear in Elijah's cries couldn't be explained away by a simple phase. He had heard every possible explanation from his mother over the years, but now, it felt like she was hiding something that didn't add up. The more he stared at her, the more the tension between them seemed to grow. It was like there was an invisible wall rising between them, one built on unspoken truths and suppressed emotions. Marcus stood up, still holding Elijah, and began pacing around the room. He needed to think. He needed to figure this out before it was too late. His son's cries echoed in his ears, growing more intense with each passing second. He had to find out what was wrong. He had to know why his mother seemed so different now. What was she hiding? Rachel, who had been watching everything unfold quietly, finally spoke up. "Marcus, maybe we should call a doctor. Maybe Elijah is just having a bad day." Marcus stopped in his tracks and turned to her. There was genuine concern in her voice, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She, too, could feel the heaviness in the air. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong, and no one was talking about it. "I don't think it's that simple, Rachel," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "I think Elijah's afraid of something in this house. And right now, I don't know if it's safe to ignore it." Rachel looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. She knew he was right. She could see it in his face. He wasn't just being paranoid. There was something deeper at play here, something they both needed to figure out. "I'll call the doctor," she said softly, standing up and walking to the phone on the wall. But Marcus wasn't focused on the doctor. His thoughts were fixed solely on his mother and the strange behavior she was exhibiting. What was it about her that made Elijah react this way? As Rachel spoke to the doctor on the phone, Marcus continued to watch Mrs. Jenkins, trying to catch any sign that would explain what was going on. She had her hands folded in her lap now, her lips tight and her eyes focused on the floor. Her shoulders were hunched, as if she were physically trying to shrink away from the situation. Why was she acting like this? Why was she avoiding his gaze? It didn't make sense. Marcus walked over to his mother and sat down beside her. "Mom," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "Please, tell me what's going on. I can't stand seeing Elijah like this. I don't know what's happening, but I need you to help me understand. Mrs. Jenkins didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, staring at her hands. For a long moment, Marcus thought she wasn't going to speak at all. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted anyone to find out." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. What was she talking about? What did she mean? Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, each one thick with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite place. He leaned in closer, his voice urgent. "What are you talking about, Mom?" he asked again, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" She looked up at him then, and for the first time, Marcus saw fear in her eyes, true, deep fear. It wasn't the kind of fear he was used to seeing in her, the kind she would hide behind her calm and reassuring facade. This was something different. This was something dark, something that had been buried deep inside her for a long time. "I didn't think it would affect him," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I should have known. I should have realized that he would remember." "Remember what?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. This was it. This was the moment when everything was about to change. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. "When Elijah was born," she began, "there were things that happened before. Things I never told you about. Things that I should have kept buried. But I didn't. I let them slip away, and now, they're coming back. They're coming back to haunt me." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. His heart was racing now, his thoughts spinning wildly. What was his mother talking about? What was she hiding? The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Elijah's soft whimpering. Marcus's mind raced. There had to be more. There had to be a reason for his son's fear. But what was it? What had happened before his birth that was so terrible, so horrifying, that it had the power to affect his son now? He waited, his breath held in anticipation, but Mrs. Jenkins didn't speak again. Instead, she looked down at her hands and said nothing. The weight of her words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for the first time, Marcus felt a deep fear. The fear wasn't just for Elijah anymore, it was for his family. Something was broken. Something had been hidden. And now, it was about to surface. Days passed, and Marcus couldn't ignore the pattern. Every time Mrs. Jenkins came close, Elijah's cries became more intense. The normally joyful baby, who would smile and giggle at anyone, now turned stiff and fearful when his grandmother entered the room. His face would turn bright red, and his little body would shake as if something had startled him deeply. It was heartbreaking. Marcus had never seen Elijah react like this to anyone before. Elijah had always been a calm baby. He would happily play with toys, giggle when his parents made silly faces, and enjoy the company of everyone around him. But when Mrs. Jenkins was near, all of that seemed to change. The small, innocent child who once laughed and cooed now shrieked in terror at her presence. Marcus couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. What was happening? Why was his son, who was normally so content, afraid of his grandmother? At first, Marcus tried to brush it off, telling himself that babies sometimes go through strange phases. Maybe it was just a coincidence that Elijah cried every time his grandmother came close. But the days went by, and the pattern didn't change. In fact, it only got worse. Each time Mrs. Jenkins leaned down to pick up Elijah, his cries grew louder, more frantic, as if he were trying to escape from something terrifying. Marcus watched helplessly from the doorway. He saw how Elijah's small body would stiffen as Mrs. Jenkins reached out for him, his little hands grasping for his father's arms as though begging to be held. It was the kind of reaction Marcus had never expected. It made no sense. His mother had always been a kind and loving grandmother. So why was Elijah so afraid of her? One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Marcus decided he had had enough. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to understand why his son was so terrified of his mother. The house felt heavy with tension, and Marcus knew that if he didn't do something now, it would only get worse. He waited until Rachel left the house to run some errands, giving him the perfect opportunity to observe without any interruptions. He crept quietly into the hallway, just outside the living room, where Mrs. Jenkins was playing with Elijah on the floor. He crouched low behind the doorway, careful not to make a sound, and watched intently. His heart raced as he waited for the moment when his mother would reach for the baby again. Sure enough, after a few moments of play, Mrs. Jenkins slowly leaned down to pick Elijah up. As her hands reached toward him, Elijah's eyes widened in terror. The cries began almost immediately, louder than ever. His tiny face scrunched up in panic, his hands outstretched toward Marcus, as though he were trying to escape his grandmother's grasp. But what Marcus noticed next sent a chill down his spine. As Mrs. Jenkins reached out for Elijah, her hands trembled. It was subtle, just a slight quiver in her fingers, but it was there. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he focused on the movement. She quickly tried to hide it by clasping her hands together, but it was too late. He had seen it. What was going on? Why was his mother's hand shaking like that? It wasn't like her at all. Mrs. Jenkins had always been a steady, calm presence in the family. She never showed any signs of nervousness or unease. But now, here she was, trembling in front of Elijah, as though she was afraid of something. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. What could possibly be causing his mother to act this way? Why was Elijah so afraid of her? And why did his mother's hands tremble whenever she reached for the baby? Marcus's breath caught in his throat as a horrifying thought crossed his mind. Could it be that his mother was hiding something? Could there be a reason, something that had happened in the past, that was making Elijah react this way? He had never questioned Mrs. Jenkins before, but now, doubt began to creep into his thoughts. What was she hiding? And what did it have to do with Elijah? He couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to know the truth. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he quietly stepped back from the doorway, retreating down the hallway. He knew what he had to do next. It was time to confront his mother, to ask the questions he had been avoiding. But the more Marcus thought about it, the more uncertain he became. He had always trusted his mother. She had been a guiding force in his life, the one person who had always been there for him. Could it really be true? Could she be hiding something so terrible that it was affecting Elijah? Or was it possible that he was simply overreacting, letting his mind get carried away by fear? Marcus paced back and forth in the hallway, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe. But one thing was certain, the fear in Elijah's cries was real. It wasn't just a phase. This was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. As he stood there, lost in thought, the sound of Elijah's cries echoed down the hallway, pulling Marcus out of his reverie. He looked toward the living room again. His mother was holding Elijah now, but the baby was still sobbing uncontrollably, his small body writhing in her arms. Marcus felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He knew he couldn't keep ignoring the situation. He had to act. With a deep breath, Marcus walked back into the living room. Mrs. Jenkins looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. She quickly tried to comfort Elijah, but the baby's cries didn't slow down. Marcus took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Mom," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "We need to talk." Mrs. Jenkins looked at him, her face unreadable, before slowly setting Elijah down on the floor. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though deciding whether or not to speak. Marcus could feel the tension between them growing, the silence hanging heavy in the air. I know something's going on, Marcus continued. I know Elijah is scared, and I know you're hiding something. I need you to tell me what's going on, Mom. What are you hiding? For the first time, Marcus saw something flicker in his mother's eyes. Fear. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was as if she was struggling to find the right thing to say. Her hands, which had been trembling earlier, were now clenched tightly in her lap. She began, but then stopped herself. She shook her head, as though trying to clear away the thoughts that had been troubling her. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he held it back. He wasn't going to push her too hard. He just needed her to trust him, to tell him the truth. I can't help you if you don't tell me, Marcus said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and determination. We need to figure this out. Elijah deserves to feel safe, and I won't rest until I know why he's afraid. Mrs. Jenkins looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with emotion. Then, finally, she spoke. I never wanted you to find out. I never wanted this to affect Elijah, she said quietly. Her voice was shaky now, as though the walls she had carefully built around herself were beginning to crumble. What happened, Mom? Marcus asked, his heart pounding in his chest. What are you so afraid of? Mrs. Jenkins sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years had suddenly become too much to bear. She looked at Marcus, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. I don't know where to begin, she whispered. But I'll tell you everything. It's time you knew the truth. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he stood there, staring at his mother, waiting for the truth. His mind raced, every thought crashing together, forming a whirlwind of questions. His son's fear, his mother's trembling hands, the strange atmosphere in the house, it was all beginning to make sense, but there was still a missing piece, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything. Mom, Marcus said again, his voice steady but filled with a growing unease, why is Elijah so afraid of you? What's going on? His words hung in the air, thick with tension. His mother's face had gone pale, and for the first time, he noticed a tremor in her hands. She avoided his gaze, looking away, as if she were trying to find a way to escape the conversation. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't going to let this go. He had to know the truth. Mom, he repeated, his voice firmer now, I need you to tell me. Why is Elijah afraid of you? What happened? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Mrs. Jenkins seemed lost in her thoughts, her face clouded with regret. Marcus could feel his stomach twist in knots. Every second that passed without an answer felt like an eternity. Finally, Mrs. Jenkins let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of years of secrets was becoming too much to bear. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes filled with sorrow, and whispered, I didn't want you to find out like this. But there's something you don't know about me, something that happened years ago. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Something had happened. Something that his mother had kept hidden for years. Marcus's mind raced. What could it be? What was the secret that his mother had been keeping from him all this time? In that moment, Marcus's heart began to pound even harder. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the full picture was still out of reach. His son's fear, his mother's strange behavior, the way Elijah reacted every time she came near, it was all connected. But how? Mrs. Jenkins seemed to struggle with her words, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. I never wanted this to affect you, Marcus, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's time you knew the truth. She stopped, as though the words were too painful to speak. Marcus took a step closer, his voice softer now, filled with both concern and desperation. What truth, Mom? What happened? Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, her eyes welling up with tears. She seemed to be searching for the right words, but nothing came easily. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. I wasn't always the person you think I am, she said, her voice trembling. There's something about me, something I did years ago, that changed everything. And I never wanted you to find out, but I think you need to know. Marcus's mind was spinning. What was she talking about? What could possibly be so terrible that it would cause Elijah to react the way he had? I don't understand, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. What do you mean? What did you do? Mrs. Jenkins looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. It was when I was younger, she began slowly, her voice distant as if she were reliving something painful. I was a different person back then. I did things, terrible things. Things I'm not proud of. Marcus felt his heart sink. What could his mother have possibly done that was so awful? He wanted to believe her. He wanted to understand. But the words were coming out too slowly, too painfully. I don't know how to say this, she continued, her voice barely audible. But years ago, I hurt someone. Someone very close to me. And I hurt them in a way that no one should ever hurt another person. Marcus's mind raced. Hurt someone? But who? And why hadn't she told him about this before? Why had she kept it hidden for so long? I don't even know why I did it, Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice breaking. I was young, foolish, and angry. I made a terrible mistake. And when it happened, I thought I could just forget about it. But the truth is, I can never forget. And now, Elijah, he can feel it. He can sense what I did. Marcus was stunned. His heart was pounding in his chest, his hands shaking as he tried to process what his mother was saying. What do you mean, he can sense it? Elijah's just a baby. How could he possibly know? Mrs. Jenkins looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. It's not just about me, she said quietly. It's about what happened here, in this house. Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine. What do you mean? What happened here? Mrs. Jenkins's face paled even further. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for what she was about to reveal. Years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I made a pact. A pact with someone I shouldn't have. I didn't realize the consequences of what I was doing. But the darkness, it followed me. It followed me into this house, into this very room. Marcus's stomach turned. A pact? Darkness. What was she talking about? His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the words. What could possibly be so terrible that it would haunt their family for years? I didn't want to believe it at first, Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice trembling. But after Elijah was born, I started to see things. Strange things. Things I couldn't explain. And I realized that the pact I made had cursed this house. It had cursed my family. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The truth was becoming clear, but it was something he could hardly believe. His mother's secret was something far darker than he could have ever imagined. You're saying the reason Elijah is afraid is because of something that happened years ago? Marcus asked, his voice shaky. Because of something you did? Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. I never wanted this to happen, Marcus. I never wanted you to be involved in all of this. But the curse, it's here. And now, Elijah can sense it? He can feel the fear, the darkness, that has been following us all these years. Marcus felt as if the world was crashing down around him. His mother, the woman he had trusted his whole life, had been hiding something so terrible, so unimaginable. And now it was affecting his son. But what can we do? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. How can we fix this? Mrs. Jenkins looked at him, her face a mixture of regret and fear. I don't know if there's anything we can do. The curse is strong. But I have to tell you, there's something we need to do before it's too late. Marcus's heart raced as he waited for her to continue. What is it, Mom? What do we need to do? Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, her voice filled with the weight of the years of guilt she had carried. We have to break the pact. But doing that, it will come with a price. Marcus's thoughts were racing, his mind struggling to process everything his mother had just revealed. A pact? A curse? The idea was too much to bear, but as he looked at his mother's face, he could see the fear and the sorrow in her eyes. She was telling the truth, there was no doubt about that. This was no coincidence. This was something deeply rooted in their past, something dark and terrifying. The weight of her words pressed down on Marcus's chest like an invisible force. He could feel the tension building inside him, his heart beating faster as he realized the implications of what she had said. A curse had followed them all these years. And now, his son, little Elijah, was caught in the middle of it. He didn't know what to say. His thoughts were a blur. What could he do? How could he fix something like this? How could he protect his son from a curse that had haunted his family for so long? The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was working overtime, trying to find a solution, but nothing made sense. What could be done? How could they possibly break something so powerful, so ancient? Finally, it was his mother who spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, she said softly, there's one thing we can try. But it's dangerous. And it might not work. It's the only way to break the curse. Marcus looked at her, his eyes wide with urgency. What is it, Mom? What do we have to do? Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, as though she were weighing her words carefully. We have to go back to where it all began, she said slowly. We need to return to the place where the pact was made. The place where everything started. We have to confront it, face it head on, and break it before it's too late. Marcus's mind raced as he processed her words. Return to where it all began? The place where the pact had been made? What did she mean? He had no idea what she was talking about. All he knew was that he had to act fast. Elijah was in danger, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. But where? He asked urgently. Where is this place? What do you mean? Mrs. Jenkins stood up slowly, her movements heavy with years of regret. She walked over to the window, staring out at the quiet street outside. For a moment, Marcus thought she wasn't going to answer. But then, she spoke, her voice barely audible. The old house, she whispered. The one we used to live in before we moved here. The one on Maple Street. That's where it all started. That's where the pact was made. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The old house. He remembered it just barely. It had been sold years ago, long before Elijah was born. But the memories of that place, of the way it had felt, were still vivid in his mind. It was a house that had always felt wrong. There was something about it that never sat right with him, even as a child. He felt a chill run down his spine as he thought about it. Could that old house really hold the key to breaking the curse? Could that be where all of this began? I never told you this, Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice shaking now, but when we lived in that house, I was desperate. I was lost. I felt like nothing in my life was going the way it should. That's when I met her. The woman who offered me the deal. Marcus's heart raced as he tried to keep up. A woman? A deal? What was his mother talking about? She told me that she could make all my problems go away, Mrs. Jenkins continued, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. She said she could give me everything I ever wanted: money, power, success. All I had to do was make a pact with her. Marcus felt a cold shiver run through him. A pact with someone who wasn't human? The idea was almost too much to bear. I was young and foolish, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice filled with regret. I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't understand the consequences. I thought it was just a simple promise, something that would make everything better. But it wasn't. It was a curse. And it's been following us ever since. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was too much to process, too much to understand. How could a simple pact lead to something so dark, so dangerous? What happened after you made the pact? Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. What did she want in return? Mrs. Jenkins turned to face him, her eyes filled with sorrow. I never knew. That's the thing. She never told me what the price would be. She just said that it would come when the time was right. And now, I think Elijah is the one who's paying the price. Marcus's mind was spinning. Elijah. What did his son have to do with this? Why was he the one who was suffering because of something that had happened years ago? We have to go to the old house, Marcus, Mrs. Jenkins said urgently. That's the only way we can end this. That's the only way we can save Elijah. We have to confront the darkness head on and break the curse. If we don't, it will keep coming for us. It will never stop. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't know if he was ready for this. He didn't know if he could handle what they might find in that old house. But he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let his son suffer anymore. He had to protect Elijah, no matter what. We'll go, Marcus said, his voice firm. We'll go to the old house. We'll face whatever it is and end this. For Elijah. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her face a mixture of fear and determination. Thank you, Marcus, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. I never wanted this to happen. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. Marcus could hardly believe what had just unfolded. The chaos of his world was still spinning, and his mind raced. The police had arrived so quickly. The officers had been efficient, but even their swift actions couldn't erase the horror of what they had uncovered. For years, Marcus had been blind to the secrets lurking within his family, and now the truth was laid bare before him. After dialing 911, his heart had thundered in his chest. His voice had shaken as he described his fears, trying to explain what was happening to Elijah, trying to make the officers understand. My son is reacting to something in the house, he had said. It's connected to my mother. At the time, Marcus wasn't even sure what he meant. He had just been desperate to do something, anything, to protect his son. But now, as the police carefully examined the house, he realized just how deep the darkness ran. The basement had always been off limits, a place that felt cold and unwelcoming. It wasn't much to look at: a small, dark room in the lower part of the house with old furniture and boxes stuffed with memories. But today, as the officers went down there, it became the center of everything. It was there, beneath the house that had once been their family's safe space, that Marcus discovered the truth. He stood in the living room, waiting as the officers worked. His eyes were fixed on the door to the basement. He had always avoided going down there, feeling an unease that he had never been able to shake. His mother had told him it was just a storage room, nothing important. But that had been a lie built on years of secrets and half-truths. One officer came back upstairs, his face grave. Mr. Davis, he called, his voice low. We found something. Marcus's stomach dropped. He walked over to the officer, his legs feeling heavy, as if they didn't belong to him. "What did you find?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The officer handed him a small notebook. It was old, worn, and covered in dust, but Marcus could immediately tell it was important. His heart pounded in his chest as he opened it, flipping through pages filled with symbols, names, and dates he didn't understand. But then, on one page, there was something that made him stop. It was a photograph. A picture of his mother. And beside her, a man Marcus didn't recognize. They were standing together, both smiling, both dressed in strange, dark clothing. The photo was taken in the same basement he stood in now, and what caught Marcus's eye was the small object clutched in his mother's hand. It was a symbol. A symbol that he had seen before on the items he had found in the basement earlier. The officer spoke again, his voice full of authority. "There are more photographs like this down there. They seem to be from years ago, possibly before your son was born. They show your mother, along with strange rituals being performed." Marcus felt his body go numb. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mother, involved in dark rituals? How could that be possible? She had always been the loving, caring matriarch of their family. She had raised him, cared for him, and had been there for him when he needed her the most. But now, it seemed that the woman he had trusted with his life had been hiding a terrible secret. The officer led Marcus down into the basement. The room felt colder now, the shadows in the corners darker. As he stepped further into the room, Marcus saw the full extent of the horror his mother had kept hidden. There were strange, old books stacked on the shelves, their pages yellowed and fragile. There were jars filled with objects he couldn't quite identify, their contents disturbing in their mystery. And there, in the center of the room, was a large, ornate altar. The altar was covered in symbols and strange carvings. Candles were still burning, their flickering flames casting an eerie glow on the walls. And it was here, in the center of all of this, that Marcus saw something that chilled him to the bone. Photographs of Elijah. Dozens of them. Some of the pictures were recent, showing his son playing in the living room, smiling and happy. But there were others, older ones. These were taken before Elijah had even been born, and they were eerily similar to the pictures in the notebook. Marcus's hands shook as he picked up one of the photographs. It showed Elijah, sitting on the same couch where they had all gathered countless times. But there was something wrong with the picture. The baby in the photo was not the Elijah he knew. There was a shadow behind him, dark and looming, stretching across the room. "Why?" Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "Why would she do this? Why would she involve Elijah?" The officer placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression serious. "It's clear now, Mr. Davis. Your mother was involved in something far beyond what you could have imagined. It's a cult, or at least, it was. This house, these items, it's all part of something much bigger." A cold shiver ran down Marcus's spine. He felt sick to his stomach. His mother had been part of something evil, something dark. But why? And what did it mean for his son? The police continued their investigation, and as they did, they uncovered more disturbing details. The altar was not just a symbol of the dark rituals performed in the past, it was a focal point, a place where the pact had been sealed. The items around it were part of an ancient tradition, a belief system that had no place in their modern world. Finally, after hours of investigation, the truth came out. Mrs. Jenkins had been involved in a cult, a secret group that practiced dark rituals and made pacts for power. She had made a deal years ago, and now, that deal had come full circle. The price of that deal had been her family, Marcus, and now, Elijah. As the authorities took her into custody, the weight of the situation hit Marcus like a tidal wave. His mother, the woman he had trusted his entire life, had kept a dark secret. And now, because of her actions, his son had been affected. The days that followed were a blur. The investigation continued, and Mrs. Jenkins was arrested and charged with multiple offenses related to her involvement in the cult. The police uncovered a network of people who had been part of the same group, and soon, Marcus learned that many others had been affected by the same dark forces. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of relief. Elijah was safe. The danger was over. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in the living room with his son, he looked at Elijah's bright eyes and realized that he had done the right thing. His son was free from the fear that had plagued him. They were safe now. The house, once filled with the weight of secrets and fear, now felt different. It felt like a new beginning. As Marcus sat on the couch with Elijah in his arms, his thoughts swirled like a storm in his mind. He had always believed that his family was built on trust and love. Growing up, he had never imagined that secrets could hide so deeply beneath the surface. Yet, life had a way of teaching lessons when you least expected them. And this lesson, although painful, was one he would never forget. It was strange how, for so many years, everything had seemed perfect. His mother, Mrs. Jenkins, had always been the strong, loving figure at the center of their family. She was the one who held the family together. The one who comforted them in times of grief. The one who celebrated their joys. No one had ever questioned her role. No one had ever suspected that she could be hiding something so dark. But now, as Marcus held his son, he couldn't help but wonder how much of the world around him had been an illusion. The world he thought he knew, with its warmth and comfort, had been shattered by a truth he could never have imagined. His mother had been involved in something evil, something beyond comprehension. And yet, despite all the darkness, his son was safe. Marcus looked down at Elijah, his small face peaceful in sleep. The soft rise and fall of his chest brought a sense of calm to Marcus's heart. Elijah had been through so much, even if he didn't fully understand it. He had felt the fear, the unease, the confusion. But now, he was free. The danger had passed, and he was safe in his Father's arms. Sometimes, the things we love most hide the deepest secrets, Marcus thought, his mind still racing. He had loved his mother with all his heart, never once questioning her. And yet, the truth had come crashing down, revealing a side of her that he could never have imagined. How could someone who had been so caring, so gentle, be involved in something so terrible? But as Marcus looked around the room, he realized something important. The house was still standing. The love he had for his son had not wavered. Even in the face of betrayal, he had not lost everything. His family was still there, his wife, Rachel, and Elijah, both of whom he would protect with everything he had. It was a new beginning. A chance to rebuild and heal. He thought about all the times his mother had been there for him, all the memories they had shared. But now, those memories were tainted. The person he had trusted most had been hiding something dark, and that truth was something he would have to come to terms with. But at least, he thought, he had found the truth. And in doing so, he had saved his son. No matter how painful it was, the truth was always worth finding. Sometimes, you had to look deep into the darkness to find the light. Marcus held Elijah a little tighter, feeling the weight of the situation. The world around him was still spinning, but now, he felt stronger. The knowledge that he had done the right thing gave him a sense of peace. No matter how much pain it caused, he had acted when it mattered most. And that made all the difference. Sometimes, the truth isn't what you expect, Marcus thought, his mind slowly coming to terms with everything that had happened. He had been forced to confront a truth about his family, about his mother, and about the world he lived in. But in the end, the truth was always worth finding. Even when it hurt. Even when it was hard to understand. As the days passed, Marcus and Rachel worked to rebuild their lives. The house, once filled with fear, slowly began to feel like home again. The walls that had once held dark secrets now stood as a symbol of strength. They had survived. They had faced the truth, no matter how difficult it had been, and come out stronger on the other side. Elijah grew, free from the fear that had haunted him. The boy who had once cried in fear at the sight of his grandmother now smiled and laughed without hesitation. He was a child once again, unburdened by the weight of the past. And Marcus, as his father, would always be there to protect him. As time went on, Marcus found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned. It was easy to live in a world of comfort, to trust that everything was as it seemed. But sometimes, you had to look deeper. Sometimes, the truth wasn't something you found in the light. Sometimes, you had to search through the shadows to understand the whole picture. Life had a way of revealing things when you were ready to see them. And although Marcus hadn't been prepared for the truth about his mother, he had learned that facing it was the only way to move forward. It wasn't always easy, but it was always necessary. Everything happens for a reason, Marcus thought. Even the hardest truths. They shape us. They make us stronger. He was learning to embrace the idea that, sometimes, the hardest moments in life were the ones that brought the greatest growth. Facing the truth had been painful, but it had also been freeing. It had allowed him to protect his son, to give him a future without fear. And that was all that mattered. As Marcus and Rachel sat together one evening, watching Elijah play with his toys, they shared a quiet moment of understanding. They had faced something dark, but now they could see the light again. They had been through a storm, but they had made it to the other side. Sometimes, it's the hardest things in life that teach us the most, Marcus said softly, his voice filled with a quiet strength. Rachel looked at him and smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. They both knew it was true. In the end, Marcus had learned that life wasn't about avoiding the darkness. It was about facing it, no matter how difficult, and finding a way to bring light into the world. And that was exactly what he intended to do for the rest of his life. Truth, no matter how difficult, will always set us free, Marcus thought. Holding Elijah in his arms, he felt a sense of peace. The truth had been found, justice had been served, and his family was safe. And for that, he was thankful.